The logical layer is where the rules and protocols that make the internet function are defined and maintained. And it involves the procedures that ensure interoperability, communication, and data transmission. And this layer is crucial for the technical functioning of the internet. It ensures that data moves reliably from one point to another and that different systems can communicate to each other. The logical layer makes the internet tick, and it's not a tangible thing, but rather a set of procedures that create the rules that ensure that all the processes necessary to make the internet function actually work. And finally, the physical layer, which consists of the tangible infrastructure that makes the internet possible. It's the hardware and the physical layer through which data is carried. The physical layer of the internet is the most tangible to people. Examples are undersea fiber optic cables, cellular towers, data centers, satellites, routers, for example. And these layers are interdependent. Each layer plays a critical role in making the internet what it is today, and changes or governance issues in one layer can ripple across others. So, how do decisions made at standards developing organizations impact human rights? Well, there are different technical standards bodies, and they impact various human rights in distinct ways, often depending on the specific standards they develop and the areas of technology that they govern. For example, standards related to data encryption, storage, transmission dictate how secure or vulnerable personal data is. And they're developed at the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. Weak encryption standards can expose people to surveillance, data breaches, or government control, directly impacting users' privacy and security online. For example, debates around the inclusion of encryption backdoors in communication standards are often proposed by law enforcement, directly impacting the right to privacy. And by setting standards for data routing and communication, the IETF influences how easily people can access information online. Standards developed at the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, another alphabet soup. The standards developed here determine how content is filtered, distributed, or even prioritized, and those standards can limit or enhance freedom of speech. The ICANN oversees the domain name system and allocates IP addresses, ensuring that the global uniqueness of domain names, such as .com or .org, are maintained. And for instance, protocols that manage domain names can be used to block or censor entire platforms or websites, effectively silencing dissent and marginalizing certain voices and affecting how individuals and organizations present themselves online. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, it's a bit of a mouthful, the IEEE. The IEEE develops standards for hardware and communication technologies. The one you'll probably know about is Wi-Fi. They developed that standard. And they facilitate connectivity and access to information, supporting the right to seek and receive information. And these standards enable diverse devices to connect to each other, can help lower costs, improve access, close digital divides, supporting economic rights and the ability of marginalized groups to participate in the digital economy. Only 2 more to go for the standards, but there is the World Wide Web Consortium, or its acronym is known as the W3C. There they develop web standards. Ones you might know of are like HTML, CSS, and accessibility guidelines. And standards here, the standards developed here promote accessibility and ensure that individuals with disabilities can access information online. For example, W3C has a standard on web content accessibility guidelines, which ensures that websites are usable by people with disabilities. Um, the final standards body I'll talk about is the International. Hello? Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you some examples of how ITU standards around spectrum allocation intersect with human rights. In some regions, the allocation of broad independent media. Okay. Yeah. So basically, spectrum allocation decisions at the ITU can significantly influence the availability and quality of communication services in different regions. Limited access to spectrum can hinder the development of telecommunications infrastructure, exacerbating the digital divide and impacting access to information for marginalized and also rural communities. So, standard setting bodies, like the one I just mentioned, are crucial to developing protocols and systems that underpin global connectivity and communication. And historically, participation in these organizations has been dominated by private corporations, large technology companies, governments, with relatively little representation from civil society or marginalized communities. As a result, the priorities of these actors often shape the standards, which can lead to prioritizing commercial interests over the public interest, with a focus on profitability, often at the expense of privacy, accessibility, and inclusivity. And it also favors state control or surveillance over individuals, particularly in regions where repressive governments are seeking to control the digital space. So, technical standards are far from neutral. The decision-making spaces where these technical standards are being developed are also far from neutral. They're not just technical spaces. They're where they have political, cultural, social, and economic ramifications. And it impacts how people can exercise their human rights. So inclusive participation in standard setting bodies and the development of human rights centered standards are essential to ensure that the internet and digital technologies promote rather than harm fundamental rights. So by engaging in these bodies, civil society, these people right here, amongst others, can help create a more inclusive, open, and equitable internet that serves all people rather than just a few. So now I've just briefly sped through what that is, and I'm sure you might have some questions afterwards. But I'm gonna ask some questions to our panelists, the ones who have actually been engaging in these bodies. So I'm just gonna throw it out to whoever wants to answer first or answer another question. So, based on your experiences engaging in these spaces, what are the most pressing issues you've observed on the African continent that connect your work in standards developing organizations? And sort of how do these challenges manifest in the broader digital ecosystem?
All right. By the way, he's my boss, so whatever he says stands. um, Anyways, my name is Sanu Slemansani, and I work with Paradigm Initiative as a programs officer. And I have been engaging with these bodies for close to a year. I do have some insights, but I know among the audience, obviously, there are people that knows better. But from what I have seen so far is, there are so many compounding issues when we are talking about when we are talking about the issues of engaging with the technical standard bodies, especially from the African perspective, or the CSOs from Africa. Uh, One of this is the technical issues, the technical nature of this conversation. Um, the reality is the African CSOs are not equipped, um, as it stands, to kind of engage meaningfully in this kind of conversation. So there is this gap of technical knowledge, the capacity of the people engaging in these forums to make meaningful contribution to the conversation. And also, even if you want to make the contribution, let's assume you have the technical experience and the knowledge, then your contribution is limited by the fact on ground, because infrastructure wise we are not at par with the rest of the world, if you look at it from that angle. The issue of connectivity, the reality on ground is there is still huge digital divide, and also the infrastructure here. We usually import the infrastructures, and they are developed based on the Western, you know, cultural and political settings, and also the demand of the infrastructure. Let me give you an example. Um, the routers and the servers, they demand um, a bandwidth, like a lot of bandwidth, which, if you look at the African context, there is no enough bandwidth to do that. So that limits how they function in the continent. But the standard that developed, or that guides the development of those, were based on the Western setting. So there is no African voice that speaks to the context and reality, and also the need of the African, people. That's the second one, and I think also there is issue of the internal politics of the standard bodies as well. There is this confrontational relationship between the commercial and non-commercial people in this um, standard bodies. So there is always no consensus on what is going to be the standard, and most often you will see that the final decision is leaning towards what the commercial bodies, or the commercial stakeholders want in this internet standard body. So, like I said, it's compounding issues. Like, there are so many issues, but I believe my my co-panelist can add one or two to that as well.
Okay. My name again is Ntavi Singh from Lesotho. I am an ICANN fellow with Article 19. I have been a fellow for the past 20 months now, and my experience in participating in the ICANN policy making process, where the main things are IP addresses, domain names, and things like internationalized domain names. The first challenge is indeed the expertise to meaningfully participate. In joining the ICANN meetings, the first obstacle is the language, the jargon, and the kind of language that goes on there. Takes a while for one to appreciate and now start to contribute a sentence or two in a policy development process. Meetings take place weekly. The other challenge is making the time to participate in those meetings. The internet connectivity where I come from is not always the best. Sometimes it will be time for a meeting, but my Wi-Fi is not showing any signal, so I miss that meeting. The next meeting I joined, that topic was discussed. I cannot make a contribution because I couldn't make it to the meeting because internet access was not there. Um, Also, sometimes meetings have to be in person, like when there's an ICANN meeting that was in Rwanda last time. I was able to attend and could contribute a thing or two while I was there. But sometimes travel costs make it impossible to travel to a meeting. It becomes a matter of joining remotely, but as a working person and the meeting takes place online all day, it's impossible to participate all day and follow all the discussions if you're not there in person. Sometimes the meeting is even in a time zone different, very different from yours. For example, if the meeting is in the US, let's say California, and I'm in Lesotho, it means I have to attend the meeting at night, and during the day I have to be at work. It becomes impossible. So while we definitely want to contribute something as the civil society, participation is not always easy, but we try.
Okay, just at this juncture, maybe to sorry, just to add that let's even say, for example, you get to participate there, but then you know, the impact of your contribution is quite limited because of the people that will make the final call. You might submit just because I can have their meeting in Rwanda doesn't mean like there is an inclusive participation. Of course, probably the Rwandans might be there just as spectators. Doesn't mean they are at the table to make a meaningful contribution. So that's another factor as well.
I think Sunny alluded to what I was going to say too in terms of participation. You can be in the room, but you can only just. I mean, you might be in the room, but you are just making up the numbers. You are not necessarily effectively participating. And using ICANN as an example, an ITU. I remember in 2018, I participated at the ITU Plenipotentiary conference in Dubai, and even getting into the room was a lot of work. Because you can't get into the room if your government doesn't put you on their delegation. So you have to first lobby your national government to so that you can be added to the national delegation. But even your presence there, you're just supposed to be there and observe, not to really contribute to what is happening there. I recall what used to happen. Even I mean, I won't mention the name of my country, but I know most people in the room know where I'm from. But we probably had one of the highest delegation at the conference. But what typically would happen is that when the negotiations are happening, I'll literally be looking around to find people who are from my country, right? Every evening we would do a debrief, and when we get to the debrief meeting, then I'll see everybody in the room. But when it gets to where the actual negotiation is happening, I won't find them in the room because people are out there just shopping. What typically happens is that before the conference, there is usually some sort of planning that goes around people. So, for example, in the ITU, this is ITU. So there is the ATU, which is the regional, the African region. So they typically would have met and agree that they would designate who is going to speak on behalf of the cohort. They would also agree on the test that they are going to speak to. And so what most members of the delegation does is when they get to the country, or in this case it was Dubai, what a great place to holiday, right? So at the end of the day, when the actual meetings are happening, you don't even find most of the people in the room. They are out there shopping, exploring the city, and we only see them during the debrief session. Now, for someone like me coming from a civil society space, I'm used to sitting in rooms and having an opinion. But you are here, you don't have an opinion. You're not even going to be given the microphone. Nobody's going to even recognize you, right? So that's one of the challenges. To be able to effectively participate, you must be able to also effectively participate at the national level and at the regional level. That's where you can actually make inputs. As long as your input is not captured at that level, going there is just going to make up the numbers. It's not going to really matter. But of course, it can also be an opportunity to build the skills required for you to understand the process and probably to be able to follow up in the subsequent. I think the plenipotentiary happens every 4 years. But one of the challenges is also that, for example, I was at the plenipotentiary in 2018, but I wasn't there in 2022. which was 4 years later, because the resources that was available for me to participate in 2018 was no longer available in 2022. So there was no follow up. So whatever I learned participating in 2022 became a waste because I couldn't follow up with that process. In 2018, when I participated, I could not add value. The experience would have been valuable if I had an opportunity to participate in 2022 because I now understand the process, I understand how to make input, but then I don't have the resources to join the negotiation that would typically happen prior to the actual conference. Also in ICANN as well. I've been engaging in ICANN for a while, and it's really very interesting because there are many challenges. Sani spoke to languages, even understanding some of the acronyms, the languages, the processes can be a lot of headache. But what else? There's also another part of it, which is the politics. I think the politics is even the craziest. The the kind of conversation that happens in terms of representation, in terms of making decisions, agreeing on, for example, who is going to represent. So in ICANN, for example, there is resources. I think ICANN has a lot of money, so they usually provide resources for sponsored participation. But making decisions in terms of that, who then goes, the kind of politics that's go into it, I tell myself that I don't think I'm interested in this politics. If I don't get resources from external sources, I will not go. I will not look for funding from ICANN to be there because when those resources are announced, the kind of lobbying that goes into it and all of that. So I think these issues affect the ability of society to engage in those processes. And that's why it's great that we have an opportunity to do this work with Article 19, whereby we were able to get some resources to engage. We were in the ICANN 89, right? Before 89, I think we were also in Puerto Rico, right? Yeah, we were in Puerto Rico as well. So the project gave us an opportunity to participate in the process, to understand the process, and I do think that actually being able to get resources outside of what ICANN provides even puts you in a better position because then you are not stuck in the internal politics that has to happen for you to be selected as a representative. You can go there with your own mind, have your own opinion and contribute to the conversation. And also beyond participating at the ICANN conferences, being able to also participate in the groups like the NCSG, for example, NCUC as well, and the NOMCOM and all of that. I am on those listserv. We have a lot of engagement there. The policies, you can also volunteer and all of that. But I do think that the real challenge is the sustainability of those efforts, right? ICANN particularly, if you are going to make impact in ICANN, you have to sustain your efforts. You have to stay on the issue, spend some time to get visibility, and when you get that visibility, people begin to respect your opinion on issues and all that, because ICANN does a lot of work requiring volunteering. So if you have some time, you're able to volunteer, provide input into policy development processes. That is an opportunity for me, for civil society, to become visible in those processes. But we also know that civil society have their own challenges. They don't have enough resources. So how much bandwidth do we have as civil society organizations to just be in a space and volunteering? We are not getting resources for doing the job. We are just volunteering and all of that. So I also do think that, I honestly hope that institutions like the DRL and other funding organizations can continue to provide sustained support for the Article 19s of this world, the paradigm initiative of this world, to continue to be able to continue to engage in a long-term approach whereby we can build the actual capacity. Even the national engagement that we did, we wanted to do some work with what's that organization again? The one NIRA, which is the Internet Registry Organization. You need to see how much process we went through, asking us questions, asking us to provide information about our organization before they were comfortable to work with us. But eventually we were successful to kind of understand what Internet Registry is like, how does it work, how do they assign numbers, and how do they assign domain names and etc. Yeah, but we are grateful for the opportunity and also for the little progress that we have made as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you also maybe speak to your engagement with governments in these spaces a little bit more? Have you been successful being on the delegation, being the expert, being the human rights person that can speak to these issues? How receptive have they been overall?
So that's a very interesting. You know, when you are known as a civil society organization, one that focuses on human rights and one that has done work around holding government accountable. I recall that we had reached out to the Nigerian government at some point. Okay, I just gave out myself. So we had reached out to say that we wanted to participate in the ITU, and one of my colleagues wanted him to be on the delegation, right? So we reached out, and there were a lot of other issues, digital inclusion issues, we were also discussing with the government at the time. So we reached out to propose a meeting, and they were not sure of why we wanted to meet with them. They were scared because they know that we are always calling them out and stuff like that. So they were a bit, you know, but eventually they gave us an audience. But the interesting thing is that by the time we told them why we came, they were like, "Oh, that's why you came? Oh, no problem. Just send us a letter and all of that," and they were more than happy to have us on their delegation. So I think it's tricky, it's perception, the lack of trust that typically exists between government and civil society organization. So they always feel like civil society organizations are always criticizing them, they don't see anything good in them. So because of that, that also makes them to be a bit closed towards society and treaties. So but when they realize that we're not there to criticize them, we're not there to call them names, they were more than happy to have us on board to engage the process. But as I said earlier, the challenges with that is also that it is not helpful to engage government at the point where you want to join the delegation. It's always better to engage them much earlier when the negotiation were still happening, when they are trying to negotiate at the regional block level. Because what I've seen with the ITU particularly is that most times African governments goes to the ITU as a regional bloc. So they usually negotiate at the regional level and agree on their positions as a regional bloc before they go into the ITU meeting. So I think one lesson we should take away from that is that our engagement should not focus on participation in convenings, because convening is more like just formality. The position that each regions are going to take, they've already decided on it before they went for the convening. So even if you don't go for the convening and you are able to participate in the negotiation that happens before the convening, you will have made much more impact. Thank
To add to what Bonnie has said, uh, in Lesotho, for example, after having learned about all the standards developments going on and having seen how much of the standards are not being applied in the country, I would approach the relevant authorities, and an example is with the internationalized domain names, because the language in Lesotho is Sesotho, and Sesotho uses some accents and such. And when we realized that the authority that runs the national domain name, which is usually called the CCTLD, still has a policy that forbids the use of accents and such in domain names, we approached the government to say, you need to change this policy because now it excludes the use of our language in domain names. But that discussion takes you up and down, because they also, for some reason, do not participate in things like ICANN meetings. And when you try to make them aware of the new standards that are now making it easier for people to be on the internet in their own language, government is not listening. So it's hard.
Yeah, just to add to that, from Article 19's experience engaging in the ITU radio communication sector, so specifically around spectrum allocation and satellite connectivity, you would think that perhaps during, we engage as part of the Brazilian delegation, and you would think that, you know, during the Bolsonaro regime, that it would have been really difficult to advocate for human rights at the regional level to then take it to the international level. And actually, because I don't want to say blanket or generalization, but you, even the sort of like disconnected nature between the centralized government and what's happening at the technical standards level can be so disparate. It was actually much easier to engage with the regional standards body to push for human rights considerations there during the Bolsonaro regime compared to like currently, for example. So just to add some more complexity to the scene. So many of you also engage in global governance processes as well, like the Global Digital Compact, other, UN sort of norm setting processes, right? Um, how do you see what is happening at that level versus what is happening, and how does that translate to what's happening within standard setting bodies? Do you see any translation of these norms and processes into standards? You know, and yeah, that's my question.
Okay.
Perhaps you could speak about AI. Everyone loves to speak about AI right now. And the high level advisory board just released their report. There were quite some interesting takes about uh, voices and inclusion from the global south. So,
Yeah, I think those calls are very justifiable, to be honest, and I believe like the new um, international instruments that are coming up, like the GDC, kind of sticks to establish universal principles for the governance of the internet, and these objectives, if you look at them, uh, kind of closely intersect with uh, the the established standards that we are dealing with at the moment, just a bit of improvement. And if we can explore, how to make amends of the, we have made mention of so many problems in terms of the engagement, in terms of, the internet politics in these spaces. So I believe this is like a second chance to rectify all of this. Now we have a new instrument that governs the internet, and we can't afford to kind of repeat what is happening with the past instruments, like the settings. So maybe the GDC or the various, standards that govern these standard bodies should kind of align. We should find a way to sit down and see how to align this, different instruments so that we can make meaningful, um, contribution, especially on the issue of the exclusion of the voices from the global south. Um, I believe this is a new chance that uh, we are presented with to make amends to that. But if guys want to add to that,
I think that it was surprising to see the adoption of the GDC, because up until the last minute there were concerns that it wasn't going to be adopted, right? Because there were contrarian views from technical community and civil society organization and academics as well around certain languages. But it was amazing to see that the GDC was eventually adopted. But I I had an opportunity to speak at a ministerial session that was held because I was in New York for the Summit of the Future. There was a ministerial session organized by the FOC chair, the government of Netherlands, and which also had the Secretary of State for the US in attendance. And I did make the point that yes, we can celebrate the adoption of the GDC, but the real win is if those principles are if they cascade into other processes. So, for example, how does the GDC affect standard settings, right, at that level? How does it also affect policy at national level and at regional level? Because, for example, the GDC inspired the African Union to introduce what we know as now the ADC. The ADC emanated from the sky. I don't know if anybody understands what I mean by that. Many of us woke up one morning and realized that it's an ADC. There was no conversation, there was no consultation, and all of that. But the GDC was not like that. There was a lot of consultation that went into the adoption of the GDC. So, if we have global processes, The actual benefit is when we are able to cascade it into other processes. So for me, what I see is that to what extent, for example, is the GDC going to influence other processes, standard settings? Does it encourage more inclusiveness around standard setting? I think it was Sani. Was it Sani that said? I don't know whether it was Puli or Sani that talked about being a spectator in this in the you know in some of those processes. So for me, I think that the task ahead of us is to say that if the GDC is going to inspire us in any way, it is to inspire us to be able to duplicate not just the lectures of the GDC, but also the process, the how. How did we arrive at the GDC? For a lot of organizations, for even for countries, up to like hours before the GDC, I mean, the procedure was broken. Yeah, up to hours, like hours to the adoption of GDC, there were still countries that had issues to say that no, we are not going to accept and all of that. And that's the power of consultation. Because at the end of the day, it was adopted, and it was adopted by consensus, including those who disagreed with certain elements of the GDC. And that's for me is very powerful. And so for me, what I'm looking at is how do we replicate such processes in other settings, internet standard setting, national policy settings, to say that we will respect inclusiveness, we will respect engagement, we will respect consultation, we will allow people to have their opinion on what we're trying to do, right? We may not always agree, but I think there is something powerful about even giving people a voice, ability to have an opinion about what is being discussed, about what is being done. So but I do think that the gain is that we have something we can use as a norm, as a global norm, that this is how the GDC was done, this is how this should be done, or this is what the GDC says. We have to align with the letters or with the principles of the GDC. For I think that's one of the win of the GDC for me. It is not even it's not even in the content for me. It's about the process and the ability for us to then say this is a very good template for us to adopt in other contexts, including in internet standard setting context as well.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's the process. We can also learn a lot from it of like what didn't work and how we can improve that at regional levels or at national levels. So I completely second that. Okay, so we're about at the end of our panel, but I just wanted to throw it out to the audience and see if you have any questions for any of us and
Or comments.
or comments.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I was in the wrong session. I just discovered that at the last moment. My name is Rena Malek Al-Hamidi. I'm a Moroccan trans feminist leader and the founder and executive director of Italian NGO, the first and only sex worker-led organization that working explicitly on promoting sex worker rights and the MENA region. So basically that's a very interesting topic, honestly, that we've been discussing years and years and years and years now. And as you said, we should learn from what didn't work also. So basically, speaking about internet infrastructures, while it has been designed to normally connect people, it often leaves behind the most marginalized communities, such like the LGBTQ+ and sex workers, especially in North Africa and the MENA region and or Swana region or the Global South in general. And this is due to a lot of financial and also cultural, if I may say so, and policy barriers such like the stigma and homophobia and also criminalization. So I think that it's necessary that technical standards needs to address this kind of gaps. So my question to you, from your experience, how can we ensure that civil society organizations representing these communities are supported to engage in the standards development process at first and ensure that these spaces are safer to all human rights defenders, including Gen Z, trans, LGBT, sex workers, and making sure that it's left in no one behind. And in the same regions, particularly the same also communities, especially sex workers and LGBTQ+, either they are individuals or organizations, often face this kind of state surveillance and censorship. especially in our regions, which is like facilitated by internet infrastructures and policies. So how do you think also that this technical standards may be developed to maybe resist being co-opted by repressive governments first, and instead protect the privacy and digital rights of these vulnerable communities and groups? And for the same communities, the online spaces, and we need to be sure about this, are often the only places and spaces where they can express themselves kind of freely and access like kind of support networks. But like with the increasing of surveillance and data collection, our digital safety is constantly at risk. So, from your experiences as well, how do you think that internet infrastructures may be designed to ensure freedom of expression without exposing exposing like their users to threats of persecution? And my last point is, um, this like silences our voices. So how can internet standards address the algorithmic bias that disproportionately affect these marginalized communities, and ensure that it supports an inclusive digital environment and tackles and also shed lights on barriers to the participation in standards development?
My name is Sarah Wesonga. I work with Article 19 Eastern Africa as the Senior Program Manager, Freedom of Expression and Information Integrity. And mine is a bit of a comment and just observations that we've had with standard setting in the region and development. And I think I agree with what Adeboye and the panelists have said about when we talk about standards, quite often you actually hear international standards, international best practice. So it's rarely driven, from the region. This is rarely something that is, meaningfully co-opted or developed in the region. And you see this in a lot of processes when it comes to just the general internet infrastructure, just being cognizant that we have countries that are still very much struggling with the basic infrastructure that they said. For instance, just accessibility, awareness. How are we able to stay safe on the internet? How do we access, devices that are able to, to get to the internet? That's the first thing. The second thing is the fact that we're still grappling with like the bare minimum human rights protections around the use. Of course, right now, internet is actually access to internet is also a human right, right? And so we are still grappling with ensuring that this is actually provided, particularly in the African region. So a lot of times when it comes to standard setting, we're not coming in on equal footing, because while the global north is thinking about, oh, how do we adopt AI and all this, for the rest of us, the question is, how do we make sure this is accessible to everyone? So ideally, when it comes to conversations around standard setting, we are not coming to the table on equal footing. And interestingly, during the GDC, the consultations for the Global Digital Compact, this came in quite often in terms of what is the priority for the region, because the idea was a safe, a secure internet for the future. But the question was, what are the priorities for the region? And one of the things that I'd really, really like to look at in terms of what worked with the GDC is that all the reports for the consultations are actually available on the website. I did the report for the Africa consultations. So you're able to see what other regions were talking about, and you're able to see what are their priorities. And then you understand why there was a lot of breaking of like the silent protocol, because there was no consensus around this. And you come to realize, like, across the board, even though there are certain shared concerns, priorities are very different in terms of what does a safe, secure, accessible internet look like for various regions. So the question is, with the knowledge gap, with the capacity gaps, with the infrastructure gaps, with the funding gaps, how then standards, when you're talking about inclusive standards just across the board, how do we make sure regional marginalized voices actually come to the table on that equal footing? And then the idea of meaningful inclusion, and this is also, especially with international processes, with the GDC, one of our concerns was with, and I'll say this with, without fear of ever, but African countries are usually brought on the table in order to push certain specific agendas. They are not seen as people who are able to drive certain things, but we are brought into the table in the event that X country wants they'll vote to sway this way, or they want to gain popularity on this priority. So the question is, for instance, you hear, oh, America wants ABCD, China wants EFGH, Russia wants XYZ. So it becomes not really what Africa wants, but who's able to buy us, right? It's not really, we are not really driving the agenda. And so this is actually quite visible in the outcome of these negotiations, in the outcome of these papers. And a lot of times we look at the delegations that have been sent to negotiate this, and it's people who, for instance, we say at civil society, we strengthen capacity, we train them, we work with them, but realistically the people who end up in New York and Geneva really are not the people who are able to articulate these issues, because what they tell us is we are given the priorities in terms of how do we speak, what do we do. So ideally, these voices and input are not really clearly reflected in the outcomes. So if you're talking about developing standards across the board, how do we ensure that aspect of meaningful inclusion, especially when you're all coming in at an unequal footing? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel O'Malley from the National Endowment for Democracy, and I think the final closing session is going to be the state of internet freedom in Africa, and if it's so we're going to be learning about that. And I remember at the opening that Wakabi noted, we have a number of people who've been in power for 30 years, even though something like the majority of Africans are under the age of 25. So we know that there are challenges in the kind of democracy space globally, and even in the country that I come from that I won't mention, but you can guess what it is. And we know that there are challenges here in Africa too. And so I'm wondering, this is a question for the panelists, what would you say is a technical standard, a standard that you've been working on that you think influencing it would have some impact on this greater question of democracy and freedom of expression in Africa?
Thank you. My name is Amadouba. I'm from USAID Sahel Regional Office, Democracy and Governance Specialist. My question is, for this thank you for this presentation, very interesting, new word, new some acronym I didn't catch up, but I think it is interesting to see there are some standards that we need to work on, particularly civil society in terms of advocacy. But my question is, are there any, I think there are a gap from what is on the certain country, European, American country, that they are far from what they need on the African country region. And even in the African, I think they have some gaps between countries in terms of infrastructure and in terms of what they know. When we set up a standard, are they standard work for this country, or we have a struggling for having connection, having network? It's not the same if on the country that they have network, they have more sustainable and more presence in terms of infrastructure than others. Do you need, in terms of the technician or civil society, do you need to sometime to how I can say it, to try to have a specific needs, to respond to specific needs from country to country?
Okay, I'll start with the last question. From the perspective of a developing country like mine, because we do not innovate, we never take standards to standard making bodies for consideration. We always follow standards developed by others to support innovations they have created. I think that's where the problem begins, because those innovations are often not created to solve the problems of my country. They are developed to solve the problems of those who have seen the problem and started solving it. Yes. And then I'll go to the next question about whether the standards that are being developed, whether we see the impact for them on democracy. Is that correct? Okay. The standard that I would say would make a difference as I have mentioned in ICANN, is the internationalized domain names and universal acceptance, because it means we no longer are forced to use English and a few other languages on the internet to express ourselves and to find or access information. For someone whose country 95% of the population speak one language which is not English, which is not any of the international languages, that's a big deal. And I think if we do it right, we'll get a lot more people on the internet expressing themselves, sharing information, learning, and all the benefits that one gets from being on the internet. Because now we have connectivity in my country. Connectivity is very high. The internet is relatively cheap, but it's not being used because the language. Yeah. So I'll leave the other questions to my colleague.
Okay. So you have addressed some of the questions, so I would just like try to touch on the rest of the questions. There is another question from the colleague from MENA as well, asking about meaningful participation of the marginalized communities. How do we do that? Let's take away the funding and everything. I think um, first, for you to have a meaningful participation in those standard bodies, you have to have the requisite um, uh, technical knowledge. That's one of the main barriers that kind of hinders participation in that. So obviously, the CSOs that wants to engage in such activities need to understand at least the basics of these technical languages and all of that, because even if you get the chance to be there, if you don't understand what is happening, what are the acronyms are, or the impacts of like the protocols that are being proposed and policies, the participation is not going to make any meaningful um, outcome to that. So yeah, and also you need to be persistent. Like Boye made mention of, this conversation are happening on a daily basis, and it requires a lot of your time, your energy, and effort to sustain that engagement. So that is where building coalition comes in. You need support of other, CSOs. Even, for example, from MENA, obviously being mostly dominated by the Muslim community and all of that, you have a limited voice and all of that. So you need support outside the region. You need to build coalition. You need to build strategic relationship with other CSOs, so that even if your voice is restricted, at least your message and your contribution can get to the table when these conversations are happening. I think another one is the question around which of the standard settings organizations engaging in the standard setting organization will make the most strategic influence. Reference to freedom of expression and censorship. So the thing is, uh, all of these standard setting organizations have their own focus. Internet is very, very vast. For example, the W3C is focusing on the the website standards, www standards, and all of that, which to some extent can affect access to information, censorship on what could be available on the internet or not. As the government can request, you know, that could be on the internet. So also you have ITU, that regulates the global telecommunication networks and services, IETF, and the ICANN that regulates the DNS. So it's hard to say which one specifically, but if I'm to point just one, I would say is the IETF, um, specifically looking at the reference of the censorship, surveillance, censorship, and freedom of expression. yes, Sarah made that's a comment, but yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think
I just want to add to your question. Um, Article 19, it's a sort of a global organization, and we do a lot of building evidence on the harms of technologies. And we use that evidence to go into standards bodies and talk about how technologies that are deployed are already out there in the world, have real world impacts and harms on specifically marginalized communities. And one of my colleagues, she's done this really incredible research where she interviewed over 5,000 people in the LGBTQI plus community in 5 MENA countries. It took a number of years where she exposed how um, dating apps like Grindr and Tinder have been used to entrap queer people, to target them, and things like that. And she built this evidence, but she also worked with those companies, with Grindr, with Tinder, to make those apps safer for people to use, because those people were not going to stop using it. That was the consensus she found after doing all these interviews. They were going to continue using it no matter the fact that they were being targeted by the police or by law enforcement in these countries. And not only did she make apps safer, for example, cloaking the app, making it look like a calculator rather than the actual logo. She worked with these companies and demonstrated that by introducing all of these security features into the application, it not only it didn't affect their bottom line, it actually increased their bottom line because more people used the apps knowing that it was safer. And so we were able to bring evidence like this to standards bodies to show that we're not always on opposite sides. We can actually work with the private sector, the specific people within the sector, of course, with the technical community in these spaces. It's not always this antagonistic relationship where we're just talking about human rights and they're like, no, 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 this is technical, go away. So, the best way to engage, if you are interested, is to if we can't bring you there, or if other people can't bring you there to represent those people, build evidence on the harms of these technologies that are deployed so that we can bring those voices and those experiences to the table. And happy to share it if you would like to read it. It's quite long.
I just wanted to share that it's incredible research. If you go to the Article 19 website, it's called Queer Resistance and Digital Repression in Middle East and North Africa. It's incredible body of work for 4 years, and you'll be able to get some really insightful feedback from it.
Okay, well, we have like a couple of minutes left, so would you like to say any last couple of comments?
I think for me, it's encouraging others from the civil society to participate in these bodies. Start with the basics, like register and attend the meetings online. Try to find somebody to mentor you, and then when opportunities arise, to be present physically, be there, and do the best you can to contribute anyhow. It's not easy as we have indicated, but small steps and you get there. Thanks.
Right. For me, it should be that we can't overlook the influence of, regional and local advocacy efforts. Like Boye made mention, some of these decisions were being taken at the grassroots level. Not all of them, but they compile and submit their stands even before those meetings and all of that. So just to be in the picture at the regional level, at the local level, and also I think that's one of the ways that CSOs can actually influence the process, because by the time it gets to um, the standards, but it's a bit too late. Even if not too late, you need extra effort to make any meaningful engagement there.
Okay, I think I'll just add. I think for me, it's just going to be a charge for civil society organizations to embrace the responsibility to engage in standard setting spaces. It's not going to be a something that has to be done out of, well, if it's convenient we do it, if it's not convenient we don't do it. We can no longer avoid or ignore what happens at that level. I think at that level we define the parameter of what is possible in the first place. So when we advocate for rights at the policy level, I mean, that's a famous saying I have. It's religious. If the foundation be destroyed, what can the righteous do, right? So at the foundational level, we have to be deliberate about engagement. And I do think that civil society organizations that are advocating for digital rights, it is time for us to embrace as part of our responsibility, because you don't need to coach civil society organizations for them to respond to policy development at the level of national governments and all of that. But we need to then create awareness in terms of at that level of standard setting to say that a lot of things can be determined at this level, and when they are determined, even the options that you have has been set at that level. So fighting at the it's like the foundational issues have been set. So I would say that for organizations working in Africa, civil society organization in Africa, it is time for us to embrace the fact that we need to understand what happens at this level and seek the help that we need in terms of capacity, to be able to engage at that level, and embrace the reality that we cannot effectively advocate for digital rights if we are not engaging at the standard setting, conversations. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Please raise a round of applause for our panelists. Every